Hi y'all, and welcome back to my channel. And welcome to a video we're gonna get just a little bit introspective. We're going to take a look back into makeup of yesteryear. Not that long ago. I mean, if you actually think about it, but quite frankly, for me, 1 year ago might as well have been 20 years ago because I ain't got no memory. And when it comes to this makeup stuff, man, when I be scrolling through Trendmood doing research and stuff for some of my videos, I was like, that was only 2 years ago? I thought I was like 15 when that came out. So it just goes to show how much stuff gets released and how much sort of like overturn there is, where I find it funny when we've got like this one big hot thing that is like the thing to have, and then like 2 months later people are like, oh, that was a thing? And today specifically, I'm gonna be talking about and discussing some of the palettes of the past that people just used to have. Like when I started my journey, like a little bit pre-YouTube and then going on into YouTube, you know, there were some of these brands and these eyeshadow palettes that were the ones that got away. Like many a tear were shed for people who did not own these in their collection. It was like a status, a symbol of significance within the community. It's like, oh, Susie's got that thus and such palette. Whether it had to do with quality, a collaboration, a color story, we're gonna be discussing a couple different palettes today that kind of have different reasoning behind it. And I will preface this with saying that a lot of makeup turnover looking at eyeshadow palettes from 4 to 5 to 6 years ago, I feel like a fair amount of them suffer from the whole, well, other things have come out, you know, a color story that was so revolutionary back then, maybe ho-hum and kind of the norm today, like Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance. You know, so definitely we take that sort of thing into consideration, but I've got a couple different things. I thought we would just kind of sit back, take a moment, and look at the eyeshadow palettes of makeup past. And I'm gonna start this off probably with one of the most obvious, I feel, at least to me. Some of y'all may know what this is. You may see it coming. But the Kat Von D, before Kat Von D was Kendo Vegan Swift Death Beauty, when she released the Mi Vida Loca Remix palette. This was a palette that I bought kind of on a whim. I remember going to Sephora with my friend Cameron, and we were just kind of futzing around. I was like, oh, that's pretty. I like me some KVD. I like me some blue eyeshadow. And so I shilled out the $60 and I took that shiz home. And then, you know, as I became more whatever on YouTube, I got the realization that apparently a lot of people didn't get a hold of that shiz. And a lot of people wanted it. I do feel I've talked about this palette. I still actually own it. I don't put it on my eyes anymore. It's one of those sentimental whatever eyeshadow palettes that still manage to make it through the declutters. But what this eyeshadow palette had going for it then most definitely was, this eyeshadow palette was released at a time that the KVD formulation was the pièce de résistance of the makeup community. Her quality control at that point was darn near perfection, and it had a beautifully thought out, curated color wheel with the nice little neutrals. If any of y'all would have seen me post on Twitter the makeup I did 4 years ago for my wedding, I used that little inner whatever of neutrals from that palette. So there's all kinds of sentimentality going in on that shiz. I have said it once, I will say it until I die. The KVD Mi Vida Loca Remix palette was the James Charles palette before the James Charles palette was a thing. So if he thinks that he's the most bomb diggity shiznit person to come up with the idea of a palette that has everything, it's got brights and it's got neutrals, hate to break it to you, sweetheart, it's been done. And in my opinion, it was also formulated a whole heck of a lot better, but that's just me. Another thing this palette had going for it was the fact that the whole kind of like concept, I feel, of a lot of mainstream brights hadn't quite taken off yet. You had Urban Decay, but they were charging $18, $20 for a single, you know, sort of like Too Faced and Lorac and Smashbox, Tarte, you know, those brands of kind of that era when Mi Vida Loca came out, you know, they weren't really doing that. And so to have a brand that had such high consistent quality to release this palette, it was like, holy shiznit, Jesus, take the wheel. Whereas now, if they were to like re-release it, it would be kind of like a little, you know, too little, too late, because not only would we no longer be interested in buying the Mi Vida, we got these colors now. These colors are done. These colors are now done to death. Back in the day, you couldn't get your hand on colors. Now you can't swing a dead cat without being like, oh, look, it's another rainbow palette with a brown in it. You know, what used to be out of the ordinary has now sort of become the makeup marketing norm. Every brand has their own interpretation of a rainbow palette. Not only that, every brand probably has multiple interpretations of a rainbow bright palette. Do I miss the Mi Vida Loca? Do I wish I could wear it on my eyes? You best believe it. I almost hit pan on some of them shades. That was my go-to Visual K look palette. Not gonna lie, if they re-release that shiz at any point, I'd probably buy it just for nostalgia's sake. And it would be fun to do a comparison video. That would be a very interesting, a very telling video. Let's talk about another palette that during my kind of dipping into YouTube, you know, this was kind of the reason I know about these palettes, or at least these older ones, because I used to be obsessed with the need to have all the palettes that other people had. Like if it was a super popular palette that everyone wanted and everyone coveted, I would go out of my way to find that shiz on Mercari and Poshmark and pay way too much money for it. I've done it multiple times. But the Tarte X Graveyard Girl palette, and this will kind of show my age for all y'all. This was a palette that was released quite a while ago. Not saying Bunny isn't relevant anymore, but this was done at her like height of popularity, which to be quite honest, was a couple years ago. And it was kind of like I had it, I bought it, I paid too much money for it, I've decluttered it. You know, I never really had a huge affinity towards her. She was bright, she was funky, she was quirky, she was alternative. I watched a lot of her haul videos back in the day. I did not buy this palette when it actually just happened naturally. And so I kind of more bought it because I was like, well, I need to have it because it's one of those palettes that you need to have. And the quality was okay. I mean, the highlighter in that palette is probably one of the chunkiest highlighters I have ever used in my life. We had not yet perfected the formula of glitter-infused highlighter. And so it's a palette that I had and I used on occasion. This was also before I knew that Tarte was like, you know, their eyeshadow formula or the majority of their products just weren't my shiznit. And I find it so funny that when we look at these palettes that people were so obsessed with, were so diehard for, just really freaking needed, it's such an interesting, it's like archaeology. It's peeling back the layers of all of this like makeup and YouTube whatever, because, you know, you would look back on it, you're like, oh yeah, Graveyard Girl, you know. Whereas now, if she were to have a collaboration with certain whatevers, I think we'd be kind of like, okay, all right. You know, a lot of makeup companies aren't necessarily collaborating with OGs like that, you know? And it's also kind of showing this whole thing of like who used to be the OGs. You know, you look and you think and you're like, oh wow, that person used to be really popular and that YouTuber and that whatever. You know, it shows how fickle that the like course and flow of time on YouTube on this platform can be. One day you popping, and not saying she isn't popping anymore, but she's sort of that generation of YouTubers that preceded who we have now, you know, not the Emma Chamberlain, not the James Charles, not the Tana Mojo, you know, she was the Manny MUA. We had Graveyard Girl. This was early Shane Dawson. This was when Onision was still a, yeah, you know, that era. And so it's interesting to look back on it and be like, oh yeah, wow. And while the color story was pretty, the formulation was just kind of, you know, kind of powdery, really powdery, not really the funnest to work with, it was okay, but it was definitely a significant one of those sort of makeup collaboration milestones that kind of opened up the floodgate for makeup and YouTuber collaborations. Because if you actually think to like early, like the Anastasia with Tamana and the Anastasia with the original Amrezi palette, you think of that era, and we weren't collaborating nearly as much with beauty YouTubers or other YouTubers like we are now. Like today, you can't go, a week without another collaboration being announced with some brand, with some person. They really have become a dime a dozen, whereas back in the day, whenever a collaboration came out, it was something a lot more significant. Might as well talk about Anastasia Beverly Hill. We might as well talk about the modern Renaissance, which many of y'all know is one of my absolute end-all be-all favorite palettes ever. That is the palette that told me, yes, red is what you want all over your eyes. I remember when it was a thing and people were like, yeah, red, it's gonna kind of make me look dead. And I'm like, yeah. I was down to look like an absolutely glam-tastic, red-eyed, hot mess vampire. And it has helped lead me to where I am today, and I'm very grateful for it. But I remember when that shiz released, and this was another example of a brand at its peak level of quality. Like modern Renaissance quality. That there became the standard for their palettes. And so when things didn't necessarily come up to snuff as that palette, people were a bit upset. But this palette, this was like one of I remember the chaos, the absurdity, the insane level of maneuvering people were trying to do to get their hands on this. This was also when they did the glow kits and trying to find those, it wasn't gonna happen. And this was when people, I remember like looking on Mercari and Posh, you couldn't find the modern Renaissance for under $100. I mean, you literally had listings where people were like, oh, I bought this, but I intended to sell it and I want $100 for it. And one thing that this sort of significant era, this sort of incident kind of brought to light was the dangerous and harsh reality of people selling counterfeit makeup. Because as people were going online, desperate to find these things, they'd find someone listing it for 50, 60, they'd think they hit the jackpot, and lo and behold, their Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette is a fake. I myself actually bought one online and mine was a fake. It was very sad, very depressing, and very unsettling, but it did help bring to light the sort of notoriousness of this hyped up eyeshadow palette bubble that opens up that avenue for counterfeit goods. People are so desperate to get their hands on this shiz. I remember when Kylie first released her lip kits and her whatevers, and people were making, you could buy them on AliExpress, and you could buy them on like Wish, and they were all up on all like in the counterfeit, the street vendors and stuff like that, just because people were so desperate to have this shiz without realizing how bad and awful. Did you know what has been like actually proven to be found in counterfeit makeup? Rat poison. I don't think that's something we need to be putting anywhere near our bodies, let alone the sensitivities of our faces. And I know that people were aware of it sort of before this, but it was really interesting to see like how much people were like, oh wow, counterfeit makeup is a thing. And we were like, yeah, it is a thing. And Anastasia had to come out with a statement to be like, well, there's this whole weird thing with like, well, if you can see the magnets and the whatever, then it's a counterfeit palette. I remember I would go online and look at all these people had YouTube videos dedicated to how to tell a fake from a real one, between tone differences, how the packaging is laid out. It was just this whole situation. They had fake ones for the glow kits. I remember also during this time, a really, really popular video thing to do. Nady did it. Jordan Byers, back when she still did beauty content, you know, she did those, you know, reviews of the really popular fake makeup and ended up getting like chemical burns on her lips. And we decided that it wasn't safe to do that anymore. And I always find it so interesting. Maybe I'm the only person intrigued by this. Maybe I'm like lame and a nerd, but I love looking at these things. And like I said, peeling back the layers and seeing like just, even if it's just in a year, you know, just the significance and what happens surrounding this particular palette release and like what correlating things happen around that particular product. I mean, nowadays, kind of like with the KVD Mi Vida Loca, you know, back in the day, it was like, it's a red tone neutral palette. Now we're like, yep. It's another red tone neutral palette. I mean, I'm here for that shizz. I love me some red tones. But at the time, it was relatively groundbreaking. Although a lot of people do think that ABH got kind of the credit where the credit wasn't due, because Lime Crime had released their Venus palette. Although kind of at that time, Lime Crime hadn't yet come out of its notoriousness for being a crappy company. Let's talk about a palette that was, again, also very near and dear to my heart. I don't think that this one suffers as much from like the whole, oh, well, it's not relative anymore, or it's not, you know, it's outdated. But a lot of us all probably remember when Too Faced were like, all right, chocolate bar, peach palette. And everyone lost their minds because grungy, dark greeny, purpley neutrals with a pop of peach was something we had never seen in our lives before. And again, this was a palette that was just so constantly sold out. I remember going to an Ulta and they were out, they were gone, they had nothing, and they had the one on display and I was like, please, I will disinfect the shiz out of it. If I get an eye infection, I will not sue, but please let me buy the tester, because I was so desperate to have that shiz. They didn't sell me the tester, which I understand. Eventually I got my hands on it and it was my favorite palette for a very long time. For a lot of y'all who've been with me from like the day one sort of situation, this palette was held in like, like take how I feel about the Viseart Grand Pro 3 and put the Sweet Peach palette in its place. That was the level of esteem I held this thing in. And a part of me has thought, oh, maybe I could go back and buy one and see if I still love it, but I'm kind of not $50 invested into that idea, if you know what I mean. A part of me would also like to see what today's Sarai would do with it, because that matte to shimmer, if it were released today, I wouldn't buy it, because I'd be like, because it's from Too Faced. They don't have my end-all be-all formula on anything except for products that don't exist anymore. And the matte to shimmer ratio was just kind of not so much my thing now. Back in the day, I would throw up a shimmer all up in here, and then I'd put a shimmer in the crease and a shimmer, you know, my eyes let me do a lot more to them then than they do now. If I tried to do an all shimmer eye look, my eyes would probably just laugh at me. They were like, yeah, maybe at 22, but at 30, bish, you thought that ain't happening. And it's kind of really funny because you look at these companies and you think about, even in the time that I've been on YouTube, even in the time that I've been consuming makeup, the sort of acceleration of production, even in that time, is really staggering, because Too Faced, they come out with like 2, 3, 4 palettes in a year on like a really, really like pushed, really saturated year. Whereas now everybody is just releasing palettes every other week. And so when they released something, it was a lot more interesting because it didn't have as much for it to like fight against. You know, like I said, ColourPop drops a palette and you're like, okay, I don't care. And so this one came at a time where the market was a lot less saturated. And I still think today, I would love to see this color story taken by, like, say, Give Me Glow, Melt Cosmetics, just another brand that I think could really do this kind of peachy green, purpley, grungy vibe really good justice. I would love to see another company take this color story and run with it, because a lot of people, when it was released, they were like, peach, What do you mean peach? There's like 3 peach shades in there. And then Too Faced released this thing, well, you know, it's the skin, and then it's like the leaf and the twig, and then it's the decomposing flesh, which I kind of got behind. I was all okay with that. I loved the color story, but it was just something that stood out because at that time there was not as much being released. Too Faced was a lot more consistent with their quality as well as releasing less. And so it really had its opportunity to shine. It had its moment. It was like, okay, I'm released. Now it's my time for the descent of the peach. It was something new. It was interesting. It was slightly innovative. And it harkened in that era of the sweet peach. So we did the palette, and then we did the blush, and we did the face trio, and everyone was hyped and psyched and whatever about that. And then we kind of lost steam. We're just like, okay, all right, there's only so many peach-themed things you can release. And to this day, they are still releasing peach-themed things because Too Faced doesn't like letting anything go. They're like, we've got this theme, we've got it in our clutches, and we're gonna beat it to death. And then we're gonna hire a necromancer, and they're gonna bring it back to life, and then we're gonna beat it to death again. And then we're just gonna rinse and repeat until we have conquered and filled the entire world with pointless peach-themed makeup because it's an aesthetic. But I have to admit, I really, really, really enjoyed the Sweet Peach palette. And like I said, a part of me is like, do I go there? Do I try it? What do I do? But at the time, it was something I absolutely loved and advocated for. I was like, everyone needs a Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. All right, let's talk about another sort of craze, another sort of era in makeup consumerism that this one kind of lost a little bit on me. I wasn't that kind of demographic. They weren't marketing to me, or maybe they were and I just wasn't interested. I'm not entirely sure. But Natasha Denona. Now, I am unsure if Natasha Denona had her own site and then she started being carried on Sephora, and that's kind of what brought her boom into the community. But this was when she had the star palettes, which were like $200 and something dollars, and there was these big giant overlapping shimmer laden palettes. And then she said, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm going to release a $129 palette called the Sunset Palette. And everyone on planet Earth that consumes makeup is going to lose their ever flippin' minds. They are going to be going a la Black Friday on each other in order to get their hands on this shiz. And I am not entirely sure if it had anything to do with her quality or people were just like, I don't know, like just like, oh boy, reds, oranges, and yellows, and a little bit of brown. I've never seen this before. As much as I love makeup, I don't keep up with a lot of the modern groundbreaking makeup artists. So you say Natasha Denona to me, and I'm like, okay, all right, I have no idea who you are. And I remember people just raving over this palette, saying it was the best thing, the best, $129 worth every single penny. And then we're being like, that thing better apply itself. It better turn back the clock on my eyelids. It needs to do my taxes, tell me I'm pretty, buy me dinner, make me lose 10 pounds before I'm spending $129 on an eyeshadow palette. Obviously things have changed because your girl has a Divisiart. But at the time, I was completely befuddled as to what could possibly make this palette or any of her palettes. She did the Lila one too, and everyone was like, yeah, purple's F me up. It's just like, it's purple palette, people. It's not that deep. $129. I need you to stop. But I remember people just being so hyped about these palettes, and it was like, the palette that was sold out. And I remember Trend Mood would always be like, oh, like 2-3 weeks ahead. They're like, oh boy, they're going to be restocking dishes. You need to set your alarms. You need to set on your calendar. You need to know when this shiz is coming back into stock so you can buy it so your life can be complete. I remember just being like, it's just like, I was like, the gradation is okay. The matte to shimmer ratio is, it never overtook me enough to say, all right, I'm going to put the money down on that shiz. Like the Viseart Grand Pro 3, I was like, all those mattes, all those colors, all that gradation, shut up and take my money. Whereas the Natasha Denona era, I was just kind of like, all right, it's an overpriced whatever. I'm not sure. It's a lot of people's diehards. I've tried others of her $129 formula, and it has none of her $129 eyeshadows have done anything. They've never blown me away. I'm like, okay, all right, this is mid-level, high-end. We're definitely not in the luxury level of quality yet. Whereas her $65 ones are so beautifully formulated, I would recommend each and every single one of them. But $129 for the Sunset and the Lila palettes, I was just like, people I knew and loved were buying them and talking about them. And I was like, okay, I trust you guys, but I kind of don't when it comes to this. I mean, it better be a earth-shattering, world-changing experience eyeshadow. So that's one kind of trend era palettes that people needed to have that I'm just like, I haven't figured out why. I haven't discovered or uncovered the initial reasoning behind. I'm like, was it the quality? Was it the color story? Was the fact that it was Natasha Denona? Was it this whole thing kind of balled up together? Like for a while, Natasha Denona was a brand that I was like, you bougie, I don't like you. So I didn't buy from them just kind of on principle, whereas now I love their blushes. I love their highlighters. I love her $65 palettes, but the $129 era where she was just releasing that, I was like, I'm good. You do you. I'll watch other people buy them and wonder why. All right, let's end on a sort of a soft spot for me. Sort of an era that I'm like, yes, the fresh running through the field days of makeup consumerism. When companies released the same sort of thing every year. When we relied on a certain level of consistency to know what was going to happen during the holidays. And those are the Lorac Mega Pro 1 through 4. They've since not made any after 4 because I think they've realized that the market is sort of done with that theme for right now. Although if they were to come out tomorrow and announce that they were releasing like a Lorac Mega Pro that was all matte, ooh, your girl would be hard pressed not to buy that shiz. But Lorac, the Mega Pro palettes, I remember the first 2. I came in after the first one, purchased the 2, the 3, and the 4, but I remember you could not find the 1 and the 2 on Poshmark or Mercari or other reselling sites for any less than $100. And part of why people loved these palettes so much is because you were essentially getting the size of 2 of their regular Pro palettes, 1 row of mattes, 1 row of shimmers. So this had 2 rows of mattes, 2 rows of shimmers for around the same price of their regular small Pro palettes. So you got a lot of bang for your buck. And the 1 and the 2 did kind of include sort of some more interesting, more unique shades. Once again, those things that you didn't commonly see in the majority of mainstream makeup. It was like, oh, look, there's a red, there's a blue, there's a green. When the 3 came out, I remember being and seeing all those like pomegranate and reddy and rosy tones. I was all over that shiz. And the Lorac Mega Pro definitely served its purpose for the first few years. People would get really hyped up about it. We would, I bought them, I reviewed them. If I have any reviews correlating to any of these palettes or using them, I will leave it down below. But like part of the thing is nowadays when a company does the same thing over and over and over again, we start to lose steam. We start to lose interest. We're like, okay, all right. What's Lorac going to do this year? Is it going to be another Mega Pro palette? Because there's only so much you can do with a theme. And there's only so much you can do with something that you've literally done 4 times. Lorac is not a company that I consider to necessarily be on the up and up with like mainstream poppy trends. They're definitely one that likes to stay safe, stay in its own lane, and do what they like to do, which is awesome with all these brands out here popping and doing and trying to whatever with all their stuff. I do appreciate a brand that stays true to its roots and does what it does well. But with that being said, people, we just really weren't interested. It's kind of the same thing with people in the Morphe palettes. We don't want palettes the size of our laptops. We don't want palettes that have every single color. We want curation. We want depth. We want gradation. We don't want 5 or 6 of the same pasty bone, ecru, eggshell taupe setting shades, and then 5 of the same pasty, soft, champagne shimmer shades. We want something that sort of reaches a little bit more, kind of seeks a bit more excitement and depth. And we're just tired of hauling around these eyeshadow palettes that are just, oh my God. We don't want to fight with it. We want to be able to, futz with it and mess with it and have it and not have it just be this big, giant, huge thing. I enjoyed my Pro palettes while I had them. They've all been decluttered. I think I have all of them on sale on my Mercari. I don't know. I decluttered them because they were too big. There wasn't enough level of gradation for what you got. They were just something that is definitely, I feel, a product that if Lorac were to come out and be like, all right, we're reintroducing the Mega Pro, people wouldn't be hot and bothered like they were for the 1, 2, and 3. By the time the 4 came around, they were really losing steam and people kind of didn't care anymore. And then we didn't see a number 5, so I guess Lorac took the hint and decided that it wasn't worth it to invest it in another round of this. But obviously, these are just my opinions, my observations, my discussions. I would love to hear what y'all have to say about these particular products down below. This isn't a case of like, oh, well, these are bad products, or these are lame, or these are stupid. It's just looking back and seeing how kind of the expectations have changed from what we expect from a brand, what a brand used to give us, what we want in our eyeshadow palettes. It's just, I really like dissecting all different layers of things that I'm interested. I like doing it with anything that I'm really interested. Clothing, anime, alternative, whatever. I love going in deep, which is why I like doing more introspective talky videos from time to time. I love how I say from time to time, like that hasn't been the bulk majority of my content, like the past, I don't know, definitely the past 3 months. But I would love to hear what y'all have to say about these palettes down below, as well as give your thoughts on a palette from yesteryear that, you thought of. I don't know. I don't think of all of them. I haven't been on this planet that long. But thank you guys so much for watching. I love you. And as always, keep it real. Mwah!